Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a lot of news to get to today, but first I'd like to introduce Nomiki Konst, who is filling in on the left side of the table today.
Good morning.
You've done the show before with Amber. Was that fun?
It was a blast. Always a blast debating.
Great.
I'm sure we're going to have a lot of conversation today.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, we will get to our top news story in just a minute. We will be discussing, of course, the tragedy, terrible tragedy in Georgia, where 2 teachers and students were killed by 14-year-old gunmen. There's also a lot else to get to today. The Biden administration has slapped sanctions on Russia, claiming that country fueled misinformation and also funneled money to some right-wing pundits to spout pro-Russia talking points. We will definitely be talking about that. We're also going to be taking a look at why Kamala Harris isn't faring so well with Latino voters as her Democratic predecessors have. But first, let's indeed get to that horrible shooting story. The Georgia town of Winder shattered after the deadly shooting at Appalachian High School on Wednesday morning. 4 were killed in the shooting rampage, 2 students and 2 teachers. 9 others were wounded.
I was listening and you could hear gunshots like just ringing out through the school, and like you're just wondering like which one of those is going to be somebody that you're like best friends with or somebody that you love.
It was just like, when are we going to get out? Like, are we going to be safe? Or it's just what's going to happen. Like, am I safe? I'm safe. I just kept on like telling myself that I'm okay. And then I texted my mom. I was like, I'm okay. It was just about me being safe.
The suspected gunman, 14-year-old Colt Gray, a student at the school, immediately surrendered to the school resource officer and was taken into custody alive. According to Chris Hosey, the director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, he will be charged with murder and tried as an adult. Gray used an AR-15 style weapon.
Reports say that the FBI had Gray on their radar last year. Law enforcement took him and his father in for questioning over anonymous tips about online threats to commit a school shooting. The topic of gun violence has taken a backseat to other hot-button topics like abortion and immigration until yesterday. Vice President Kamala Harris reacted during her rally in New Hampshire. Take a look.
This is just a senseless tragedy on top of so many senseless tragedies. And it's just outrageous that every day in our country, in the United States of America, that parents have to send their children to school worried about whether or not their child will come home alive. It's senseless. It is, we've got to stop it. And we have to end this epidemic of gun violence in our country once and for all.
GOP nominee Donald Trump had this to say.
I mentioned we had this terrible shooting in Georgia. Right. Our prayers are with our friends in Georgia. And I've been doing town halls and interviews in public with you for all these years since you got into the political arena. And I told this audience, never before have restrictions been so tight, obviously after the assassination attempt as well. And Director Wray said the threat level has never been this bad. He said it 5 consecutive times before Congress. What is going on?
Well, it's a sick and angry world for a lot of reasons, and we're going to make it better. We're going to heal our world.
Terribly tragic, obviously. Now, but the fact that this shooter was known to law enforcement does then always raise this question of, well, what was done about that? They're saying, well, we didn't have reason to hold him or arrest him, and I understand we can't just like willy-nilly arrest anyone who manifests some deviant behavior, but so often, this was the case in Parkland too, where we're told, see something, say something, and we found out, oh, people spoke up, people reported this deranged person, and law enforcement didn't do anything about it.
Exactly.
So I don't know.
I mean, maybe there's something in our gun laws in certain states where, okay, if we can't come to some sort of compromise, which we should, in terms of stricter gun laws, maybe there's something in terms of flagging. If the FBI has flagged somebody in the past, then at least do not sell guns to them.
Well, we all think a 14-year-old shouldn't have a gun.
Don't
He's
sell.
14.
Yeah, 14. He's 14.
No guns.
His parents shouldn't have them. I mean,
Right.
maybe there should be a clearer pipeline of information with those who are providing guns, if they are purchasing them legally, which the father did, of course. And that's the troubling situation here is, like you said, we have systems in place and people are doing what they're supposed to do, and yet it's still happening. I mean, the gun crisis is much bigger, and that needs to be addressed at the federal level, undeniably. And I think people will be voting on this. I mean, we've been discussing all the other issues, and it is quite odd that this has not come up in a lot of these conversations, especially since this school had lockdown procedures. The kids were prepared. They were knowledgeable. They knew what their teachers were doing when they closed the doors and locked them. I mean, it was actually quite sad to listen to the students talk about being in the room and understanding what was at risk here and how they've been prepared for it. But despite all of these procedures, we still have a gun crisis in America, and leaders just don't want to do anything.
We do. I mean, I would argue that the kind of gun crisis we have is mostly distinct from the school shooting problem or the mass shooting problem, which, is like is 0.00 something 1% of the actual total gun deaths in this country that are mostly handgun deaths, crime, suicide, domestic violence, workplace violence, what we see in some of our inner cities, that kind of thing. A very difficult problem to grapple with because there's just so many guns out there. There's people, and often the crimes are being committed by people who are already under our existing laws because they have prior records, are not supposed to have access to firearms. There's already a law to prevent them. It's just not being enforced. So I always wonder if we can, because I don't want to, I'm a libertarian. I don't want to disarm law-abiding people. I'm obviously, show me the evidence or show me the argument for why this restriction would be good and not infringe on people's rights and make people safer. I'd be all for it. But I wonder, we have these gun laws on the books that look to me like they're not being enforced.
Right.
And then I go, well, then what good is a new law going to do if we're already letting people who are not supposed to, under current law, have access to firearms, who are committing the vast majority of the day-to-day gun crimes, we're not doing anything about it. What good would a new law even do then?
And cracking down on the networks that are smuggling guns into states where there are stricter gun laws, where there is more enforcement, like New York or Illinois. I mean, I know conservatives love to talk about Illinois, like they have strong gun laws. Yes, but there are guns being smuggled over the border from states where there are weak gun laws. So maybe the feds or states need to work together to crack down on these smuggling efforts that, whether it's organized crime or other efforts to loosen the gun laws. I mean, there's loopholes everywhere. The gun shows have loopholes. I mean, that can be cracked down on. There's so many different aspects of the law in which, state authorities can really push further, especially with those gun shows like in Arizona and Texas. I mean, there's been an independent investigation, secret camera operations to show how a lot of these guys will sell despite the fact that they have clear information that they shouldn't be selling to certain people.
But the school shooting situation, it is a difficult problem to address, clearly, because it's not that frequent that it happens, thank goodness, but it does happen. Yeah. And, how do you stop, the vast majority of people who own AR-15s use them responsibly, and their kids don't steal them and shoot up a school. And one in a gazillion times something like this happens. And so then we have to go, well, what were the signs? Did we know? Could something have been followed through on? What is the mental health situation like in our schools? Are people, because schools are really unpleasant environments for a lot of kids. A lot of kids get bullied, have to contend with other kinds of stresses. And 1 in a million snaps like this, and how do you stop it? It's a difficult problem.
It's a very American problem, too. I mean,
that's true.
There are mass shootings around the globe, but at no relationship to American mass shootings. I mean, when Australia had that one mass shooting, they cracked down on their gun laws, and it had an impact. But simultaneously, we have a mental health crisis. We're not providing adequate resources to these schools to provide support for students who are having more mental health issues because of social media, which, we've been fully aware of that. So as kids are feeling the effects of social media, normal bullying that happens as a child, they don't have that support system in place as well because we just don't want to fund it. And we need to fund mental health support. If Republicans want to say, it's about mental health, then great, go fund mental health. Go fund our schools, our public schools.
I also wanted to point out that it seems like the police response in this instance was very competent, and we should applaud that because it's not always the case. Obviously, what happened the last one in Uvalde, Texas, where the police waited outside the room for an hour as the kids were dying on the classroom inside, trapped in there with the shooter, contrary to all police instruction. They are, in fact, supposed to approach, attack, all-out assault on the shooter. You do not treat it like a hostage situation. You are supposed to confront the shooter. That's what was done here, and they were actually able to take him into custody, which is pretty remarkable.
So maybe there's some lessons being learned, but clearly not enough and not soon enough. And hopefully this does re-enter the conversation during the presidential election. It doesn't just go away like many other news items in the past. So the time, I thought in 2013, after Parkland, or after the Newtown, exactly, that something would have happened. But, I think people are also just getting tired of this conversation.
Well, and it's the broader issue of violence in our society. I mean, Donald Trump was almost just killed several weeks ago. I think it is on people's mind, the time we're living through, a time of tension and violence. More Rising right after this. Stay with us.
Hunter Biden is on trial today in a Los Angeles federal court over charges of tax evasion. He's on the hook for allegedly failing to pay $1.4 million in taxes, even as he spent millions of dollars on what prosecutors say was an extravagant lifestyle. He faces 9 counts in the LA case, 3 felony counts for tax evasion and filing false returns, plus 6 misdemeanor counts. He has pled not guilty.
Hunter's tax evasion case comes 3 months following his conviction on felony gun charges in Delaware, for which he'll be sentenced on November 13th. Prosecutors on the tax evasion case say that instead of paying his taxes, he spent the money on drugs, escorts and girlfriends, luxury hotels, rental properties, exotic cars, clothing, and other items of a personal nature. This case, as in the gun case, likely highlight the tawdry details of his addiction to crack cocaine, bringing up a dark period of his life, his murky past, viewed by many, especially his Republican rivals, as a liability for President Joe Biden. But now that Joe Biden's no longer running, Hunter Biden's legal troubles seem to be fading, at least in terms of his dad's political prospects, even though we heard just a few weeks ago new information that he had tried to get the Italian ambassador to schedule a meeting, an offer you can't refuse. Oh, you gotta pay your respects. It's just very nakedly corrupt, in some cases literally nakedly corrupt.
Literally, exactly.
And I don't think anyone cares that much about the gun situation. I don't, again, as I said earlier in the show, I support the Second Amendment. I think drugs should be legalized. I don't know if you happen to be consuming drugs and you buy a gun, is that a crime? I don't know that should be a crime. It seems very trivial. What doesn't seem so trivial is maybe the tax issue, and then whether he was being paid by foreign business interests to attempt to portray that he had sway over his father. I concede that evidence has not emerged that he actually did sway Joe Biden, but he certainly tried to rope Joe, dear old dad, into participating in the phone calls and the dinners and everything. That's what really needs to be investigated.
I mean, does he have to register as an agent, FARA?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that later today, too.
We're going to be talking about that. Everyone's going to be an expert on that very soon.
Yeah.
Those are serious questions, whether or not they're enforceable by going to prison, perhaps not, maybe it's a fine. Clearly, his judgment was not in great shape. I mean, he was under the influence. He's an addict. He's been open about that. The family's been open about that. This isn't new for presidents. I think every modern day president has had a sibling or a family member who has had some interesting, prior challenges in the law, I'll just say, from Bill Clinton to Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush himself. Sure. He was that sibling. Donald Trump is that person. So listen, I think the story is getting tired. I don't think the American people care about it. I know Republicans, especially when running against Joe Biden, were really pushing for it and wanted to have as many hearings as possible, but it just didn't seem to ever stick as a political issue. Obviously, it's a concern, and I feel very sad for the Biden family that they have to constantly deal with Hunter Biden's past acts, but it seems like he's gotten his act together a bit. He needs to pay his taxes.
But it's not as if they've kept Hunter at arm's length. I mean, we were hearing reporting, as everyone's wondering, just in recent weeks, whether Joe Biden was going to decide not to run, as he ultimately did. And it was reported by the New York Times, by credible mainstream organizations, that he is listening to Hunter Biden, that his inner circle of decision makers was his wife and his son. And I don't know. I think some voters will wonder about that choice. Maybe it's just conservatives who care about it. Obviously, they've been very invested in the influence peddling and the corruption. But and people on the left or progressives have made a lot about alleged Trump family corruption and how they've benefited from their station. I mean, some of it does seem quite blatant to me. But also what Hunter Biden was doing seems incredibly blatant at this point.
But Hunter Biden wasn't in the administration. He wasn't an official advisor as Jared Kushner was. He wasn't, taking trips on behalf of the state to negotiate deals in the Mideast. I mean, the Trump administration was the Friends and Family administration, and everyone was on the payroll. in the White House, but also outside of the White House, cutting deals with information that they were gathering from the White House. They were using the White House and the administration as an information resource so that they could go out to Albania. In the instance of the Kushner family, I mean, they're now investing in a hotel in Albania. Where did they get that information from? Clearly, they had access to a lot of intelligence, a lot of information in terms of where growth was happening and building those relationships around the world so they could continue to make money.
Sure, but I mean, Hunter did a version of that, right? He had access to his dad.
Very
He had
light.
access to his dad. I mean, that's what they were paying him for. When his dad stopped being the vice president, Burisma dropped his salary in half because that's what he was being paid for. And he did put Joe Biden on the phone when he had business meetings and dinners. He introduced, the fact checking from like the Washington Post and everything. If you read that article about, oh no, well Joe Biden never met this person. Well, actually he did. That dinner didn't take place. Actually it did. Well, he did meet it. Again, Joe Biden didn't know.
Right.
But, Joe Biden doesn't seem to know a lot of what's going around these days.
Give him some credit. Give him some credit.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's some muscle memory in Joe Biden. I mean, he's been in this position for a long time. I'm sure he can smell something when it comes forward.
I think he's going to remember to be pardoning Hunter Biden before the end. That will be my prediction. Do you think he's going to do the pardon before the term is up? I expect so. That's my guess.
I don't know. I think they're going to negotiate down whatever he's convicted of.
I think last day in office, blanket pardon. Why not? There's nothing to stop him.
I mean, it's not a great look for the Democrats.
So this has largely, I think, faded as an issue, but not because like the criminal nature of it has changed, but just because Kamala Harris is now the candidate, not Joe Biden. So it's like we're moving on. Although I guess the legal system is still, doing the taxes and everything.
But I mean, again, that can be negotiated down. That's why you hire really good lawyers. He was also under the influence. I'm not sure if that goes into his defense as to why he didn't file his taxes properly. I don't know if he handled it himself or he had a great lawyer.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be my excuse next year. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I didn't file my taxes right. I was drinking a little bit, experimenting with crack cocaine. It's all right.
It's not right.
You accept that, IRS?
It's a defense. I'm not saying it's a good defense.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for defenses, on the same note, though, let's look at the Trump family and whether or not they're going to be held accountable for their actions. There's plenty to go around there.
They're trying to lock Trump up. He's being held accountable. He's facing multiple criminal indictments. They tried to keep him off the ballot. They're trying to disqualify him as a candidate. I think the legal system is addressing Trump.
I'm saying his family, though.
Okay.
His family that is also benefiting from, this information that you would not have access to, cutting these deals all over the globe, building hotels. I'm curious as to when the Democrats want to bring that up and pull that up for investigation because, give credit where credit is due. The Republicans did keep this on the radar and law enforcement did decide to follow up. Maybe we should be doing the same thing with the Trump family, the friends and family and associates all over the globe.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't necessarily do a great job because a lot of the major revelations came not from what the House investigators are doing, but from the media finally taking more than a casual interest in what Hunter Biden has been up to, revealing, for instance, the Italian ambassador story and other things. And then, of course, that plea deal collapsing when the judge scrutinized it to say, wait, immunity from all future prosecution? That's what looked, I think, especially suspicious to so many of us. Yep. Like, well, you're saying, I mean, the judge found it suspicious. The judge said this goes well beyond anything I've ever granted to say that we wouldn't be, investigators would be prevented from looking into future investigations wouldn't be able to more closely probe. Again, the influence peddling, which is the thing that, might have some national political ramifications more so than his sordid drug use and his not paying his taxes.
I agree with you on this. I think influence peddling is dangerous for our democracy, and we should hold people accountable on both sides.
Yeah, well, we've got some influence peddling stories to get to later today. More Rising right after this. Summer is unofficially over. Students are heading back to school, and while many settle into their dorms, new class schedules, and so on, many kids at Columbia University, the epicenter of the Gaza protests this past spring, are picking up right where they left off, protesting on again. According to CBS News, Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine staged a demonstration outside campus on Tuesday, the first day of classes. They have repeatedly demanded the school divest from Israel amidst its ongoing war with Hamas.
Last school year's protests on campuses across the country highlighted the right to free speech in academic settings, which CEO and president of Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, Greg Lukianoff, says is worse today than in the last decade. In a newly published op-ed for The Hill, for its series on how to fix America, Lukyanov writes, quote, "It has gotten worse to a degree that would have been unimaginable over the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5. In the same op-ed, Lukyanov cited a survey that FIRE conducted and found that 1 in 10 students reported having been punished or threatened with punishment for their expression. Joining us now to delve into free speech and academic freedom is Greg. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And we actually just came out with our campus free speech ranking like a couple of hours ago, and that has updated data on how many students are saying that they've been punished or threatened with punishment for speech. And now it's for this year. I guess, you know, we assumed this year was going to be really bad, but now it's 1 in 3 students saying that they have been, which is unparalleled. Like, there's just nothing historically like that.
So give us some of the highlights from the report that just came out. Is Harvard, I believe, was ranked last year for free speech of all college campuses. Kind of remarkable that the most elite and well-regarded educational institution, some would say in the world, is ranked by you as the very least appreciative of our cherished free speech rights. What is the case this year?
Yeah, Harvard finished dead last again this year. And it was funny because I remember them having a response that was a little bit like sort of typical Harvard elitist, being kind of like, oh, their methodology is flawed and all this kind of stuff. And we're Harvard academics looking at it. I'm like, well, actually, a Harvard statistician is one of the people who helped us do the survey. And it gave me the opportunity to explain, listen, folks, I know you might not like it. But it's based on the largest survey of student opinion on the atmosphere for free speech on 260 almost campuses across the country ever conducted. It has the largest database of attempts to get professors fired and actually, you know, also getting them fired. Attempts to get students in trouble for their speech, the largest database of deplatforming, you know, and that includes things like shoutdowns, which have been, you know, off the charts in the past 2 years. And also the largest database of speech codes that's ever been assembled. And we combined them all, and Harvard really did earn its way on the bottom. A pleasant surprise was that last year, Michigan Technological University ended up being #1, which was also a pleasant surprise because I like it when it's a school that you might not otherwise have heard of doing so well on it. But this year, actually, a pretty well-known school came in at the #1 spot, and that was University of Virginia, which we were glad to see.
What goes into this survey? I mean, you outlined a little bit, but when you ask these questions, to walk us through the process of how students answer and what goes into asking specific questions.
Yeah, great question. So we work with a company called College Pulse, and what they do is they get together representative panels, statistically relevant panels that actually match the demographics of the given schools that they're targeting, and they they poll those panels about things like, are you comfortable disagreeing with your professors or with your fellow students? Are you, a big one is, do you have the impression that the administration has your back when it comes to freedom of speech? Do you think your administration values freedom of speech? And that's actually the one where the bottom 5 schools did disastrously poorly. So Barnard is in the bottom 5 this year, and they came in dead last on whether or not they think their administration appreciates freedom of speech. So Columbia was also the second to last spot. New York University, and I love New York University, so it kind of breaks my heart a little bit, was third from the bottom. And then rounding out the bottom is University of Pennsylvania and Barnard, and they all did terribly on appreciation for whether or not the administration actually does have their back. But the other thing that these schools generally did wrong is they allowed deplatformings to go forward. In some cases, they allowed professors to get punished, in some cases even fired for expression. So the schools that did the best, you know, they generally, when deplatforming was attempted or a shoutdown was attempted, they responded well. That they came out and said, no, we're not letting, you know, angry students shut down a talk here because they want to decide for everyone else what they're allowed to hear. Whereas at the bottom 5 schools, they, you know, didn't seem to miss an opportunity to make the wrong choice.
Give us an overview of how your organization approaches and how universities ought to approach the Palestine-Israel issue on college campuses. Obviously, we saw during the protests, you know, we saw encampments, we saw actual blocking in some cases of students being able to enter, exit areas of the university by the pro-Palestinian side. At the same time, they're certainly allowed to protest and should be expressing their views. And there have been crackdowns on those groups too that are not good. So there's like free speech violations being committed in both directions. And there was tremendous frustration directed at the university president, some of whom resigned after the congressional appearances, where they did a very bad job, I think, of seeming sympathetic to the concerns of Jewish students, while at the same time did have to point out that we are prevented in just like stopping unpleasant speech or speech that makes people uncomfortable, because that would violate the free speech protections on campuses.
Oh, I absolutely would. And, when I'm doing my job, that means I get hate mail from the right and the left. And that has only gotten more intense since October 7th, because we've defended plenty of pro-Palestinian professors and students. And of course, and not even just people on the right. Sometimes, people who are much more pro-Israel get really angry at us for that. But we also called out University of Austin, because they actually, in responding to what Governor Abbott had said about cracking down on anti-Semitism, they actually they sent cops in before encampments had taken place. And it's one of these things that's kind of like, okay, so fear of there being an encampment that's not allowed under your policies is not a justification for shutting down clearly protected speech because you think something, might happen in the future. So we called that out as well. But we also get some flack, from the left on some of these by pointing out that since October 7th, there's been an unparalleled number of shout downs and disruptions, including one, by the way, of a Jewish professor who was there to give a lecture on black holes, which is kind of like, dude, like this, like, let us go to our nerdy lecture. I don't care if this guy is like pro-Israel, you don't have a right to shut this down. But the huge number of deplatformings and shoutdowns that we've seen, they've been overwhelmingly from the pro-Palestinian side here. And it's one of these things where it's, and in some cases at Berkeley, for example, that was one where students rushed the place where a former IDF soldier was speaking. They smashed windows. They actually evacuated the speaker because it really did seem like they wanted to hurt him. And that's one of the things I think people need to get, that if you have students who are engaging in violence, there's no place for, particularly in response to speech, there should be no place for them at the university, because that is not, I always say this, you have to have the highest possible tolerance for opinion, but campuses should have no tolerance for violence.
That's a fascinating point. And are you issuing memos or advice to universities on how to improve their standing? Because what you just said to me seems very reasonable, but of course it's subjective to university leadership, campus culture. Press obviously plays a big part of this as well, and of course those groups that are being affected by these opinions.
Yeah, we're a watchdog group, so our job is to be pretty hard on universities. But what may surprise some universities is how much we bend over backwards to work with universities if they want to work with us. So, for example, I feel a little bad for Dartmouth that did pretty poorly on the ranking this year, because I know for a fact Dartmouth is, under their new leadership under Eileen Blaylock, has been working really hard over the past couple of years to actually make the environment for Dartmouth better for free speech and academic freedom. That just takes a while to actually show up in the surveys. And also when you have previous deplatforming and that kind of stuff, those knocks on your record don't immediately go away, really, nor should they. But we've been working a lot to help universities have better codes. The whole Hill article that I wrote today was advice on what universities can do to make a better environment for freedom of speech. One of the simplest things that should always be incorporated, and you'd be surprised at how few schools do this, is having an orientation where they explain the kind of profound philosophy around how we create an environment in which you can actually engage in the search for truth. And it is in some ways counterintuitive. Essentially it's kind of like, that we don't really get at truth directly. We get it by chipping away at falsity, bit by bit, and you never quite fully get there. But if you have an open environment, open marketplace of ideas, then you have an actual shot of at least inching ever closer to truth, if not ever fully getting there. So I'm thrilled to work with universities. I'm very happy to give advice. We have a big team at FIRE that will talk to them about everything from their speech codes to orientations, and I hope they will consider us a resource. But it also means that actually, one funny thing that's happened lately with my interactions with presidents. My interaction with presidents almost always begins now with saying, one thing I want to be really clear about is I have no effect on your ranking. That is, we have a system for it. We have polling. It's all based on data. And that it's not us being like, I like this school, I don't like this school. It's like, no, like we don't like. So all you can do is improve your codes, stand up for free speech. And one of the easiest things they can do is fix their codes. And really make sure that students know that the administration really does have your back when it comes to freedom of speech. But it also helps to be clear what is and isn't protected, because sometimes I think students are like, well, they're not letting us camp indefinitely, and therefore they hate freedom of speech at the school. And it's like, well, no, they actually, pretty much every school in the country has a policy that says you can't camp indefinitely, like on the open areas. But a lot of universities really screwed up by being like, yeah, we'll enforce it sometimes, but if we're sympathetic to the protest, and it's like, no, that's called viewpoint discrimination. Like that's a serious constitutional issue.
Greg Lukianoff, president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. That was fun.
In a bombshell indictment, U.S. prosecutors allege a media company linked to conservative influencers who regularly reach millions, including Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, and Dave Rubin, was secretly funded by Russian state media employees whose goal was to amplify U.S. domestic division and spread Russian propaganda. Take a listen to Attorney General Merrick Garland breaking down the indictment.
We allege that as part of that effort, RT and its employees, including the defendants, implemented a nearly $10 million scheme to fund and direct a Tennessee-based company to publish and disseminate content deemed favorable to the Russian government. To implement this scheme, the defendants directed the company to contract with U.S.-based social media influencers to share this content on their platforms. The subject matter and content of many of the videos published by the company were often consistent with Russia's interest in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to core Russian interests, particularly its ongoing war in Ukraine. The company never disclosed to the influencers or to their millions of followers its ties to RT and the Russian government.
Russia, Russia, Russia. Now, to be clear, the U.S. Justice Department does not allege any wrongdoing on the part of the influencers themselves. Instead, it's accusing these two employees of Russia Today of funneling $10 million to a Tennessee-based media company that created Russia-friendly content, what they describe as Russia-friendly content. The indictment did not name the company, though it is widely believed to be called Tenet Media. Podcaster Tim Pool released a statement on X, writing in part, quote, "Should these allegations prove true, I, as well as the other personalities and commentators, were deceived and were victims. I cannot speak for anyone else at the company as to what they do or to what they are instructed. The Culture War podcast was licensed by Tenet Media. It existed well before any license agreement with Tenet, and it will continue to exist after any such agreement expires. The only change with the agreement was that the location of the live broadcast moved to Tenet's YouTube channel. I and TCW never produced any content for Tenet Media." He also added, "Putin is a scumbag, Russia sucks." Meanwhile, Benny Johnson said on X, quote, "A year ago, a media startup pitched my company to provide content as an independent contractor. Our lawyer negotiated a standard arm's-length deal, which was later terminated. We are disturbed by the allegations in today's indictment, which make clear that myself and other influencers were victims in this alleged scheme. My lawyers will handle anyone who states or suggests otherwise." Dave Rubin said, quote, "These allegations clearly show that I and other commentators were the victims of this scheme. I knew nothing, absolutely nothing, about any of this fraudulent activity, period." Garland also announced sanctions for what he says are Russian government-sponsored attempts to manipulate U.S. public opinion ahead of the November election. Let's watch.
In a separate enforcement action, the Justice Department is seizing 32 internet domains that the Russian government and the Russian-sponsored actors have used to engage in a covert campaign to interfere and influence the outcome of our country's elections. As alleged in our court filings, President Vladimir Putin's inner circle, including Sergei Kirilnikov, directed Russian public relations companies to promote disinformation and state-sponsored narratives as part of a program to influence the 2024 U.S. presidential election. An internal planning document created by the Kremlin states that as a goal of the campaign is securing Russia's preferred outcome in the election.
Garland added that Russians were creating websites filled with Russian propaganda created by the Kremlin. The sites were designed to trick Americans into thinking the news was coming from a major outlet like the Washington Post or Fox News. Per Kremlin documents, they were, quote, bogus stories disguised as newsworthy events. They also created fake social media profiles. Now, beyond seizing the 32 internet domains, the Biden administration also sanctioned 10 individuals and entities as part of the alleged propaganda effort. Okay. Lots to get into here. So this was some big news on social media yesterday that these commentators, Tim Pool, Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, had been making YouTube videos, and it turns out that the company that was paying for them misrepresented to them their origins. If you read the indictment, they actually, they asked, well, wait, who wants to do this? Who are we doing business with? And the conspirators made up a fake person who's like a Swiss banker or a French, some European businessman.
European mysterious.
And they wanted to know, and they made a fake business resume for this guy. And it actually tipped off one of the, I can't tell from the indictment which right-wing person it was, but because it said in the business, this is like a LinkedIn profile type thing, it said wants to spread social justice. And they were like, wait a minute, why do you want to, why are you investing in right-wing commentary if you want to spread social justice? But anyway, it went through. That business person did not exist. They were routinely Googling in their emails to the Tim Pool and others, they would Google, wait, what time is it right now supposed to be in Europe? Make sure this is consistent with our story. So anyway, now I know the media is going to go crazy on this in terms of, this shows the deep penetration of Russia into our discourse. I'm going to be a little skeptical of that. I mean, they were not being told what to say by Russia. They were, they have views on, you can disagree with them, but they have their views on Ukraine and on the broader global conflict that happen to align with what this funders wanted, and they deceived them about the source of the funding. So fraud to my mind, should absolutely be prosecuted, but the victims it's actually Tim Pool, like he says in the statement.
I think there's a lot to unpack here. In their memo, they did push different messaging. If anybody's ever watched Tim Pool, unfortunately, you'll know that he's not a foreign policy expert, but suddenly he seemed to understand intricacies of the Russia-Ukrainian war and was very critical of Ukraine and Vladimir Zelensky. And
I've been critical of. I'm not an expert in foreign policy either, but I'm critical about whether Russia invaded and it is bad, and Putin is an authoritarian, and they should not have done that. I also want to reach a peace deal so that the war ends, and that's going to involve, frustration on both sides. I don't think that makes me pro-Putin.
Right, but the memo that was released in the indictment did show that there was messaging guidelines for these influencers. But this also reveals a weakness in our media system. If we thought that mainstream media was bad and had influential tactics behind the scenes, this is much worse because, some people see these folks as journalists. Some people see these folks as media figures. Some people think maybe there are teams gathering research. Whether or not you agree with it or not, there's some sort of informed decision-making behind the scenes. But they're paid influencers. And whether or not it was from Russia or not, I think that we have a weakness in our system that you can pay an influencer and frankly boost in some situations, and I'm sure that this is going to be unraveled more with the indictment, is that through the bot operations, you can boost somebody's arguments so that it goes higher up in the algorithm and more people see it and more people repeat it. The entire social media infrastructure is very manufactured. It's based on social design. And if you have money and if you have the resources and the intelligence to boost certain narratives, you can do so, whether you're a foreign government or not.
But how is that? I guess that just doesn't seem different from what the traditional media. I mean, traditional media has fun. I mean, we have, Qatar has financed media organization. China, a Chinese spy was on the payroll of the governor of New York. China owns the NBA. The players are afraid to criticize them. There's so much foreign influence going on. Like, we got to be. I think we should be not dramatic about it. It's $10 million in terms of the amount of money spent on elections by the candidates themselves is nothing. And I am seeing now, as conservatives are processing this, I'm seeing some people on the right, like David Sachs, wondering, these accounts were actually going after Trump for betraying the pro-life cause. Mm-hmm. And they want, they're not accepting it at face value that the goal of this was to boost Trump. And because actually a lot of the commentary has been very hostile to Trump in a way that might actually hurt him with general election audiences. So I think there's still a lot more to explore here. I'm sure we're going to be talking about it in the days to come. We'll have more Rising right after this. Kamala Harris's campaign stumbled again, this time when it comes to electric vehicle mandates. During her 2020 run for president, Kamala Harris supported requiring automakers to build only electric or hydrogen vehicles by 2035. During her time as California Senator, Axios points out that she co-sponsored the Zero Emissions Act in 2019 that essentially required only EVs or hydrogen vehicles sold in the U.S. by 2040. This was Harris in 2021 after the Biden administration announced it would build 500,000 charging stations for electric vehicles across the country.
There can be no doubt the future of transportation in our nation and around the world is electric. And because that is true, our nation's ability to manufacture, charge, and repair electric vehicles will determine many things, including one, the health of our communities.
But Harris's campaign now says Harris, quote, does not support an electric vehicle mandate. The campaign has not specified Harris's stance any further than that. This is a key issue in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where many automakers are based and Republicans are taking advantage of it. For example, per Axios, American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers launched $13 million swing state ad targeting Harris, her 2019 position on EVs.
As for Donald Trump, he has frequently criticized Biden and Harris' positions on EVs, but Trump has also seemingly gotten softer on EVs since getting closer to Elon Musk. For example, here Trump was in March talking about EVs before Elon Musk endorsed him. Let's watch.
On day one, I will terminate Crooked Joe's ridiculous electric vehicle mandate. They're very expensive and they can all be made in China.
And here Trump is in August after Musk formally endorsed him.
And I'm for electric cars. I have to be, because Elon endorsed me very strongly, Elon. So I have no choice. But he knows I am for him. I'm for him for a small slice is a slice.
Just a slice.
Just a little bit.
But this is another flip-flop from Kamala Harris.
From both.
From both.
He flip-flops a lot, too.
He does, but so does she, and she doesn't get half as much flack for it. She's gone back on her border policy, so many of her energy policies. And again, we're just finding this stuff out now because she didn't actually have to run a proper campaign. She was just coronated as the candidate overnight. Well, so she didn't have to debate people on her own side about, well, are you more progressive or am I more progressive, blah, 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 the way she did in 2020 with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden himself. Now she just issues statements and decrees saying, this is no longer my position.
But people are calling her out. She is being called out. I mean, she's been in this race for, a month now, and she's getting attacked left and right, literally left and right, for these issues that she has changed her positioning on. This is a tough one because it has been 5 years since she co-sponsored that bill. There have been a lot of frustration, I think, in the auto industry about moving to that deadline and having infrastructure in place to do so. The American people don't seem to want electric vehicles. Hybrids are much more popular, and it seems like our auto industry also wants to invest more in hybrids, but maybe that's the transition. Maybe it's not, there's a mandate that quickly, it's a transition into more manufacturing of hybrids, and then have a better infrastructure for electric vehicles, which, let's be real, there's the charging station issue. Can these electric vehicles make it across the state of California without charging, or make it across the country? And where are those charging stations? So I don't think it's just that you have the oil and gas industry
or something, right? Wasn't that the latest news? It's so expensive to do. Look, I like Trump. I'm for electric vehicles for a slice. No, for if people want them, that's good. Look, I am all about better, cleaner, greener technology if it's practical, if it's economical, and if it can stand on its own 2 feet. I don't want to prop up an artificial industry wholly or solely because of government subsidy, which is what it's taken in some cases, including with Elon Musk's company. Let's be real. I don't want the government, picking winners and losers in this way. I want the government. Obviously, there has to be a little bit of government coordination in terms of the charging stations being assembled, the rights and the permitting and all that. I want to make it easier for companies to go green and do energy and environmentally friendly stuff if they want. We can have less restrictions on, my God, what you have to do to put a solar panel on your own home is ridiculous. Let's make it easier. Let's relax regulations that get in the way of people opting for greener choices without having, we don't need to have, I don't want to do it with subsidies and all the rest.
Well, I believe in subsidies. I also believe that we have to hit our climate goals. But I'm also very aware that oil and gas is spending millions and millions of dollars to fight this. Not that oil and gas isn't going to survive without our transportation, but I mean, this. Let's be real. If you don't want the government to be involved, I don't want oil and gas to be dictating the terms of our.
Well, I don't want any subsidies for them either. Yeah.
Subsidies, I don't think they should be doing these influence campaigns. I mean, that's what they're afraid of. I believe this is a political conversation, just as Donald Trump outwardly said he changed his mind because he was endorsed by Elon Musk. I think that Kamala Harris
doesn't get more honest than that.
Does not.
Kamala Harris could say, I changed my mind because I realized my former policy was not popular.
Or she could say,
I'm changing my mind because the things I ran on in 2020 got me nowhere because people didn't want them.
Or she could say there are massive influence campaigns being paid for by oil and gas in key swing states, and we really need to inform the American people. But right now, we are fighting an uphill battle because hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to muddy the waters.
Muddy the water. You say influence campaign, but right there, it's calling attention. It's calling attention to what her actual positions were. Right? It's not
like advertisements.
Well, yeah, but they're true. They're correctly stating that this was her policy previously, and maybe you shouldn't, you do with that as you will, but perhaps you wouldn't trust, if you're in the industry or if your livelihood has something to do with more traditional sources of energy, maybe you ought not to trust what the Kamala Harris administration would do, given her being all over the place on this issue.
Oh, come on. You know that these ad campaigns are sophisticated, it's so sophisticated how they message. And yes, that was her position. And she's changed it because of these ads, because she's scared of losing voters in key swing states.
Yeah,
let's be real. And hopefully when she's elected, she'll go back to the mandates and put more money into electric charging stations.
Well, so what you're hoping that she's lying right now when she's saying that.
I do, actually.
All right.
Come on, it's politics.
I don't want to mandate. Why we don't need to mandate it. If it's people will adopt it if it is market viable and cost effective enough, and that's fine. I'm not going to require it. But for the good of the planet, China's not doing any of this. We can't. There's no participation. The top global polluters elsewhere in the world are doing nothing. We can't be the only goody two-shoes on the planet.
Okay, that's going to be great. We'll have that conversation when we're underwater fighting.
Oh, they always say we're going to be underwater. The whole continent hasn't sunk into the water yet. I'm just going to point that out.
Okay.
Aren't the climate, the worst case scenarios are no longer projected to be the likely outcomes, right?
I don't agree with that at all.
I don't think that's an opinion. I think that's true.
This year alone, me personally, I was near horrifying fires in Europe. We had flooding in Europe. We had flooding here. Like last time I came here a few weeks ago, there was the
climate is Eastern. It is very contested as to whether climate change is making extreme weather events worse. That is a
They're happening more often. Yes, it's debated.
This is a source of debate, and
it's not a source of debate. Every single person watching this has been affected by climate disasters. There have been more of them. This used to be a once-in-a-lifetime situation where you'd have these heat waves. Arizona, right now, Arizona's on its 100th plus day of 100-degree weather. That's never happened in history since we've been recording.
There has been, I'm not denying that their climate change is real and that it is increasing the temperature, but you mentioned fires and tornadoes and earthquakes and all that stuff. it is often casually asserted that this is due to climate change, and there is significant debate over whether extreme weather is actually getting worse.
Okay, I'm not sure it's really that debatable at this point, but okay.
We'll have more Rising right after this.
With the election so close between Trump and Harris, not a single voting bloc or vote can be taken for granted. When it comes to the Latino vote, Harris has, well, a complicated relationship. There has been a shift from Biden, and Harris is now polling at 59%. This means she closed the gap with Trump. But that said, it is well below what Obama polled at 72% and even Biden at 62%.
There are nuances within the Latino vote, and Kamala Harris has stepped in it more than once. Here with us today to break it all down is Federico de Jesús, a former communications aide to Nancy Pelosi and also Barack Obama. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Robby. Nomi, it's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers.
Oh, great to have you with us. Why don't you, lay it out for us? How is Kamala doing with this group compared to her predecessor, compared to President Joe Biden, and what does she need to do to capture more of the Latino vote?
Well, let's start with the nuance that you mentioned, Robby, because I think that it bears repeating. A lot of Latino advocates repeat it every election cycle. Again, for both parties, the Latino vote is not a monolith. There are different national origin groups, different languages, Spanish, English, Spanglish, different generations, immigrants that are citizens, people that have been here for generations, different regional aspects. The Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania aren't the same voters as in Florida. The Mexican American isn't the same as in California. The new arrivals aren't the same as people who've been in California forever. So within that context, it's also important to know that Hispanics aren't a racial group. They're an ethnic group that is multiracial. So that is important to understand. Why is it that Latino men tend to trend a little bit more towards Trump? And why is it that Democrats were lagging behind under Biden? To your question, her predecessor, Biden really ignored the immigration issue. And then it wasn't until this year that he saw the polling, even among Latinos that are concerned about border security, and moved into an enforcement-only bill. Kamala Harris went to Guatemala and said to immigrants, don't come. But she also met with her campaign staff in February before she was a candidate and said, look, I'm concerned. We need to do something about this. And she's doing a lot better. But as Nomi mentioned, she's not at the historic 63, 65, 72 the Democrats normally poll with Latino voters. And it's also important to note that it's the swing votes that count, right? It's the swing states and the Latinos in those states that matter, where she's doing very well, but again, not where she needs to be. And to answer your final question is, what does she need to do? She started very well in the convention, pivoting from border security only to comprehensive immigration reform. And polling is complicated, and we go back to the nuance. Latinos care about border security, maybe not in the way that some Trump Republicans might say it. They care about human trafficking, about drug smuggling. They don't want criminals to come into this country. But they also, and the polling shows it time and again, they favor a path to citizenship for immigrants that haven't committed crimes. So there's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of different segments of that population, and there needs to be a lot more cultural attention to those differences.
Fede, you're from Puerto Rico, and when you look at Pennsylvania, more than half of the Latinos, in that swing state are Puerto Rican, and they're not doing great. It's a major problem. Pennsylvania is probably the most important swing state, in my opinion. So what is it that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz need to do to speak to Puerto Ricans in particular? And what is Donald Trump doing? Because there was some news this week about a pretty key endorsement from a reggaeton artist for Donald Trump.
So the polling that came out from Unidos US, the largest Latino group in this country this week, especially about Hispanics in Pennsylvania, say that overall Puerto Ricans are at the high 50s, similar to other Latinos. Among Puerto Ricans born in the island, and that's an important distinction, it's in the low 60s, so they poll a lot better. But Trump is still getting 29 to 30% of the Puerto Rican vote there. And last week, Trump brought two reggaeton artists. Reggaeton is very popular among Latinos and non-Latinos. And Anuel AA, who's a convicted felon, he mentioned Puerto Rico as a country, which is another subject for another day. But those are the cultural things that Trump is paying attention to. And I haven't seen reggaeton artists come out for Kamala. Hopefully they're doing outreach and they have an opportunity to do better. But they're talking to a segment of Latino men And people that don't care about the whole crime and Trump tried to steal the election, they care about these cultural issues that obviously Trump is paying attention to, that Harris isn't paying attention. And again, she's doing a lot better than Biden in the polling. She's winning the Puerto Rican vote, but Pennsylvania was won by Biden by 80,000 votes. And there's 500,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania that could decide this crucial key state for the 2024 election. So that's a start to your question that's very complicated and long.
Yeah, that's why so many of us were a little taken aback when she did not select as her running mate the popular governor of the must-win state. Even if, you know, who you pick as your VP, it's only worth, you know, a very little bit of a boost. But if she gets that boost in Pennsylvania, that's going to be what decides the election. Is the VP, is Tim Walz someone who's resonating with Latino voters?
Well, in the case of Puerto Ricans, he voted against the Promesa law in Congress when he was a member of Congress. That's the law that imposed the fiscal control board that's unelected in Puerto Rico. He's for comprehensive immigration reform. He's progressive, pro-union, but he also appeals to the white working rural class. So obviously, you know, people in politics say that Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Alabama in between. And so there are a lot of other states that he appeals to. And if you were at the convention, like Nomi and I, and maybe Robby, you were there too, he does engender a lot of excitement. And Kamala Harris also engenders a lot of excitement among Latinos. But again, this will be won in the margins, and there's an opportunity here for both to do a lot better.
Fede, we talk a lot about the male Latino vote, but let's talk about the female Latino vote. Is there excitement the way that there is in other demographics with women, black women, white women on the Democratic side seem to be incredibly excited and motivated? Are you seeing the same thing with Latino community?
Definitely, Latina women are trending more towards Harris than Latino men, although both have increased in their share. There are a lot of kitchen table issues. There are a lot of economic issues. Kamala Harris has come up strong for taxing the rich, for expanding the child tax credit. Remember, the first expansion cut childhood poverty in half. Obviously, Republicans let it expire in Congress, so taking that up again will be key. And again, talking about border security and crime is important, but also talking about how immigrants are part of this country, being her a daughter of Jamaican and Indian immigrants. So I think that there's a great opportunity here. She looks like them and she needs to talk to them. She hasn't done a lot of TV interviews, and going on Univision, Hispanic radio, but also speaking to Latinos in English is key. Half of Latino voters speak English as a predominant language, and the other half is Spanish or Spanglish. So that's also key to remember, that you can't just have a one-size-fits-all strategy when it comes to the Latino vote.
In terms of on-the-ground organizing, what are you seeing? I mean, there's one thing to say they're not speaking or they're not talking about certain issues, but is there an on-the-ground operation in key states to organize Latino vote?
So yesterday, my good friend Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who's the granddaughter of legendary civic and agricultural leader Cesar Chavez, she tweeted that she left a meeting in Pennsylvania with Latinos. There were a lot of Puerto Ricans there and other Latinos that were excited. What I'm hearing from folks on the ground and organizers in Pennsylvania is that the campaign still hasn't invested enough on an operation. A lot of people are doing grassroots efforts to register voters. Some of the groups that I work with in my work as a consultant are doing that. And again, a lot of media presence. A lot of the people in the Hispanic media complain that Democrats have the correct policy, but they only invest in the few months before the election. I know that there are a lot of super PACs that started organizing early for the Latino vote since last year with Biden, and we need to see a lot more, especially in Pennsylvania. But in Georgia, North Carolina, and in Wisconsin, there are a lot of Latino voters that could swing the election. Again, in the margins, these elections in these key swing states will be decided by a few voters, and that's where they need to invest the most.
You mentioned correctly that she has not done, Kamala Harris, a number of TV interviews, has not spoken to the media all that much. Obviously, she didn't have to run in a primary of any sort. She was just kind of declared the candidate overnight, so she's evaded, I would argue, some level of scrutiny that is atypical for the candidate in her position. What are you hoping to hear from her during this upcoming debate with Donald Trump?
I think that a refreshing new start with Harris, which is part of the reasons he's excited a lot of progressives and a lot of independents and some anti-Trump Republicans, is that she's willing to take it on towards Trump. I think that Biden was a statesman, and when he criticized Trump, he did it in a very gingerly and forceful way. but she's a former prosecutor. So if you see the press releases, if you see her tweets, if you see the campaign messages on the trail, she's hitting Trump really hard. And I think that a lot of people were wanting and yearning for that. And she needs to do it in the debate. Now, as a strategist, I wouldn't play up how great of a debater she is. I think that in the 2019 primary, she didn't do great in those multi-candidate debates. And I think it's never a good strategy to play up your candidate. You should, it's better to overperform over expectations. And Donald Trump interrupted Biden in 2020. He obviously let Biden slide in the last disastrous performance. So I think that you shouldn't underestimate Trump's debating abilities and his antics, frankly, and his theater-like, tactics. So that's what I would recommend, and that's what I would love to see in the debate. And going again, in terms of the Latino voters, let's talk about all of the issues. Latinos are as much U.S. citizen voters as anybody else. Yes, they care about immigration, but a lot of other people care about immigration, not just Latinos and not just immigrants themselves. And so there are multiple issues here. And to go to Nomiki's questions about what she needs to do with Puerto Ricans, she needs to recognize those cultural differences, not just with artists, but how you speak to those issues. And she went to Puerto Rico, didn't really have a great campaign stop there. And I think that if you focus on key issues, and we can get to that in another show, I think she has a great opportunity. And a lot of the advocacy and diaspora groups, Puerto Rican and non-Puerto Rican pro-immigrant groups are saying they're not going to go for a border-only security bill. And so there's a lot of messages in key media markets that she should target, and I think she has a great opportunity to do that. And I think her campaign knows it, and hopefully we'll see that.
While we have you here, because you talk about Puerto Rico, we are approaching very soon, in a few weeks, the 8th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, where this was an historic hurricane which ravaged the island. The island is still dealing with power issues, privatization, and now there's a major displacement of Puerto Ricans from the island because of the economic issues that existed before, some tax laws, and of course the devastation that hit the island. You mentioned that Vice President Kamala Harris visited the island to talk about some of these things, and it didn't go so well. Can you discuss a little bit more in nuance how this plays into the voters who have been displaced, who have had to move to the United States, whether it's Florida or Pennsylvania or other parts of the country, where you're seeing, essentially climate refugees from Puerto Rico come to the United States?
So it's no secret that Donald Trump was insulting Puerto Ricans, saying that Puerto Ricans threw the federal budget out of whack, questioning the amount of deaths. It was more than 3,000. Some even say in Michigan University it was 4,000 plus, and obviously withheld aid and restricted aid. And Joe Biden released some of those restrictions, and they've invested in green energy and in housing. But according to the federal government, only 8%, according to the GAO actually, only 8% of the FEMA funding has been dispersed. And some of that is due to worker shortages and bureaucracy in Puerto Rico. And so there's a lot of nuance there, because when Kamala Harris went to showcase some of the solar panels that, thanks to the Biden administration, Puerto Ricans have access to, not a lot of people have been able to build them and put them in their homes. And so I think that she needs to be more aggressive in using the federal levers to get that money spent. And a lot of Puerto Ricans are concerned that if Donald Trump is reelected, that he might rescind that money, the unused funds. And so I think the Democrats made the mistake in 2020 of using Hurricane Maria and the paper towels as a talking point, and that wasn't that effective, frankly. And when Donald Trump called the politicians in Puerto Rico corrupt, a lot of liberals like me thought it was an insult to Puerto Ricans, but a lot of people that left the island said, yeah, one of the reasons that I did leave was because some of our politicians were corrupt. And I think that going back to the cultural aspect, Bad Bunny, the reggaeton artist, he's waded into Puerto Rican politics. He hasn't yet on U.S. politics, and there's another opportunity there for Harris to do outreach. And I think that they know this, and they have a great opportunity there. The campaign came out with a fact sheet about how much money has been invested in Puerto Rico. But if you talk to any Puerto Rican, it's one thing to approve the money, and it's quite another to actually spend it and see it on the ground. And the current governor in Puerto Rico lost his primary in part because he hasn't spent that money, and they don't see fixing the roofs and the roads and the hospitals that have been still broken down. And the electrical system is a mess. It's been privatized. And 8 years after Maria, there are even more blackouts than there were before the storm.
Federico de Jesús, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the Latino vote. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison, who's serving alongside Kamala Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, wrote a thank you message to Brazil days after the country began blocking the social media platform X. He posted, "Obrigado, Brazil." This drew a strong rebuttal from Elon Musk as well as conservatives online. Musk wrote in a message sharing Ellison's post, "The Democratic Party, same one that used to defend the First Amendment, now wants to destroy the First Amendment."
Brazil began banning access to X on Saturday after the company missed a deadline to appoint a legal representative to Brazil. According to the Associated Press, anyone found trying to get past the blockage by using VPNs could face daily fines of nearly $9,000. According to the Associated Press, we had Michael Schellenberger on yesterday, and me and Jessica really got into it over this. I think this is just unconscionable, what is going on in Brazil. I think it's shameful that Keith Ellison endorsed it. These are orders to violate free speech, to take down accounts, and they are now, X is no longer available in Brazil because of one man, one judge's desire to appoint himself the gatekeeper of what should be allowed on the platform. They don't have the First Amendment in Brazil, so maybe they can do that, but I think it's wrong.
If you are a broadcaster, you have to have a license in the United States. That is basically what was asked of Elon Musk and X, was to follow the law of essentially having a platform, a broadcast platform in Brazil, and they didn't do it. It was a very simple thing for him to do, and he didn't do it. And now in the name of free speech, which is always very questionable with Elon Musk, because free speech is not for all on X. Free speech is for whoever the algorithm wants to promote. Free speech is given to bots. Free speech is not given to shadow-bound people. The algorithm is incredibly biased towards, it's sexist and it's racist, and that's been investigated. So his idea of free speech is on his terms for his people when he wants it. But again, it's a private company, exactly. And private companies also have different rules. So he's using this absolute free speech argument, but it's not free speech absolutism at all.
Well, you criticize Elon Musk all you want. I've criticized him as well. I don't think all of the new policies are necessarily living up to the hype in terms of what he promised. But we have to be very clear about what's happening here. It's his company. He should be. If in the media you say he needs to get a license. We had Schellenberger on yesterday, and he explained that they fear for the employees' safety if they were to get a lawyer or a contractor. Schellenberger himself is under threat of being arrested there for violating. Again, it's content-based stuff. This judge has said that they have to take down certain content. Elon Musk has said, no, we're not going to do that. The government is the one saying, you talk about what the algorithm's promoting or it being manipulated. The government of Brazil is the one trying to dictate, remove content, not say it should all be available or transparent or I have some problem with your algorithm, but take down this account, including other political figures because they don't like what they have to say. I think that is so bad. We would recognize that clearly as a First Amendment violation if it was happening here in the U.S. if the government tried to say, and they did. It was not an order. It was hey, we'd really like you to take down some of this Hunter Biden stuff and COVID stuff. And Mark Zuckerberg now has said that was really bad and he regrets going along with it. But this is worse. This is an order. This is a criminal matter. And it's not just conservatives complaining about this. I actually saw a great opinion piece today from this is an editorial from the Washington Post saying that Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alejandro de Moraes has gone too far. This has come at a substantial cost to free expression, with mandates for removals and even arrest warrants often issued under seal with scant reasoning to support them. The move against X is more of the same. Also the taking down of Starlink. It sounds authoritarian. Whatever the threat to democracy the accounts wanted gone might have posed, the threat from one government official limiting the speech of 220 million people is greater. I think that's, this is from a paper obviously that's been very critical of Elon Musk. I think it's pointing out, the real danger in doing this. And I don't think it's just an issue of they have to get some kind of license. That's a pretext. They don't like the content on the site.
But also, Elon Musk has a responsibility. All tech companies have a responsibility to reduce hate speech, to reduce false information from spreading disinformation. All tech companies essentially have to report whether or not they see threats like terrorist threats. And he's not doing any of these things that even Mark Zuckerberg and Google, they are policing internally and sharing information with the government, but Elon Musk is hands-off. He's actually very hands-on, but when it comes to taking responsibility for bad actions on Twitter, on X, he is not doing so, and he's refusing to do so. And my guess is that this conversation's been going on a lot longer in Brazil, especially with the escalation of right-wing extremism that has occurred in Brazil over the past few years with Bolsonaro. no longer an entity, no longer a threat. But Twitter has been an avenue for the far right to organize with very little oversight. And when I say far right, I mean the extremists who want to storm capitals, the extremists who make threats, threats against women, threats against people of color. I mean, those things should be taken into account. You don't get free speech for everything. Free speech absolutism does not occur in this country, and especially not in Brazil. And if Elon Musk wants to operate in Brazil, Brazil has a set of laws. And if he doesn't want to follow them, then that's his problem. It's not an assault on him.
Sure, but I'm criticizing those laws in the same way I'm criticizing the laws of China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, other companies that, China said to Google, you can't operate in this country unless you suppress information about Tiananmen Square.
Yep.
I mean, this is exactly like that. This is exactly like that, except, some people think that content is not objectionable, and this is. It's content-based restriction. I, of course, agree that threats of violence should be terrorist organizations should be reported. It is reported. I'm not up to date on what level of reporting Twitter is doing. I think it's not nothing. You might say it's not enough.
Definitely not.
Generally, the social media companies do report. I always find it funny when they're criticized for not doing enough. They report so many accounts for CSAM, child sexual abuse material, terrorism, and all that. And they are required under U.S. law to do so, and they should do so. But this is not, this is people's opinion. You can say they're bad opinions. You can say the information is wrong, but misinformation is not, there's not some separate category that's not under the banner of free speech. Wrongful information, again, in the U.S., maybe not in Brazil, but in the U.S., is absolutely protected by the First Amendment. Hate speech is protected. Racist speech, sexist speech. This is the kind of speech that the ACLU, at least they used to, go to court to defend the rights of awful people to say these things. It's the same thing online. We used to, and I have to say the left used to be very good on drawing that distinction. We hate the speaker, hate the speech, but defend it. Defend your right to do it, and this is clearly, I think this is just a clear example of that principle being impugned.
My concern is not just the type of speech that's put out on Twitter, but it's also that the algorithm is promoting certain types of speech, and he is not transparent with the algorithm despite promising to do so. He has not gotten rid of the bots despite promising to do so, and he's putting his thumb on the scale of political discourse in this country. And that has serious consequences, not just on elections. We were talking about previously how Russia's doing this, but internally we have a platform that more or less has a monopoly on these types of conversations that we've gotten used to, whether journalists sharing information or politicians announcing they're not running for office or are running for office. It is such a big part of our lives, and he is putting the thumb on the scale and not calling out, getting rid of the bad actors, which can influence elections and, frankly, safety.
When federal authorities went to Facebook and said, be wary of a story that's about to come out about the Biden family and Burisma, and you should be very skeptical about that because there's this Russian influence campaign probably going on, and then the Hunter Biden laptop story does come out and they suppress it based on that information from the government. Is that not an example of thumbs being put on scales?
I agree. But there's two things can be true at the same time. Sometimes information is true, but it is also beneficial and being promoted by foreign influence. That's part of their sophisticated influence operation. But when it came to COVID and what Mark Zuckerberg said, I do think that we should have been alerting folks of false COVID solutions and all these things. They're telling people to drink bleach. That's a public health issue.
Okay, but what about? This was the case on Facebook for months. It was militantly suppressed. If you said any post asserting that COVID its origins might have been from a lab, that was brutally suppressed under, again, a health misinformation framework that now looks rather silly because now it's quite mainstream to have questions about exactly what circumstances COVID arose. Some of the early, things changed over time, right? At the beginning, Fauci said, don't bother with masks. Then he said, oh my God, get a mask. Wear two. Any mask is good. Then it was like, actually, if you're going to wear a mask, you should really wear the high-quality ones. The other ones are not doing very much. It changes over time, and that's why I get really nervous about the level of speech suppression on so many of these subjects when, yes, some of the elite expert opinion held up really well. Some of it did not. And should federal bureaucrats be making those decisions, or should we have a more situation where, there's going to be a lot of information out there. Some of it's not going to be accurate. Some of it is going to be accurate. Nobody knows. And, that's kind of like the argument for free speech, right?
But it was chaos. It was descending into chaos where even if the federal administrators of this were wrong and they were learning as they went because they had teams, doing research and investigating and, along the way, the roots of COVID or what worked and what didn't. I don't trust my neighbor, my crazy neighbor, to disseminate this information, and that can go just as viral. Well, that's the thing about algorithms.
But
if you're spicy, you can go viral. And I don't really trust the random person who has no background in public health or investigating the roots of epidemics and pandemics over the government, which has a lot more resources and a lot more tools at their disposal. And, correct, they were wrong on many things. But that doesn't mean that random people on the internet should have just as much authority.
Well, but I leave that up to people to decide. It's not, who am I to say who are I can make an argument for it, but they were asserting not just that these people were wrong, that we're going to correct their information with information of our own, but that they should be thrown off social media. Again, sometimes for things that turned out to be wrong, like the lab leak, some of the at the highest level, it was, get the vaccine to protect yourself from infection. And we all got breakthrough cases. That didn't end up. The vaccines have held up in terms of the importance of protecting oneself against severe disease and death, particularly if you're older or immunocompromised. But that was not what Joe Biden himself said about it when it first rolled out. So it's made me even more wary than I was previously of suppressing information, even if it might be wrong, because who gets to decide that? I think that's got to be our collective judgment. And again, going back to Twitter, to X, some of this false information, it gets fact-checked on the site itself through community notes.
Sort of.
More than sort of.
Sometimes, but
it's better than Facebook in that way, where Facebook's fact-checking is outsourced to these random activist organizations that they've fact-checked me wrongly numerous times. They've taken out articles of mine where I say, why is this taken down? And they say, because you made this claim. I go, this claim does not even appear in this article, and then it gets restored.
Or if you share a post and it's a meme, you're cited and you get two more marks on Instagram and then you're banned.
Exactly.
I don't agree with that either. I think that there has to be some sort of reasoning and it can't just be based on some algorithmic understanding of whether this is true or not true. I mean, if you share a post, you shouldn't be held just as liable as the person who created that meme and is spreading the disinformation. Right. The whole goal is to stop disinformation from spreading, and that, again, comes down to algorithms, in my opinion.
Well, that does it for us today on Rising. It was great being with you today. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for swinging by. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts. Thanks so much. See you later.